joining us this evening. It's wonderful to see over 50 people giving up their Friday television to join us for this talk. Now, I remember about 10 years ago, I gave a talk to the parish about the history of this particular church. And I remember apologising at the beginning of the talk because I was still quite a new boy. I'd only lived in Uxbridge for about 18 months. And I felt rather conscious that I was kind of intruding into the locality and talking about local history, something which people feel very kind of protective of. I guess 10 years on, I don't really have to apologise quite so much, because actually I've lived in Uxbridge longer than I've lived anywhere else. So I've been here 12 years now. So I really do regard Uxbridge as my home. So I hope I don't have to apologise this evening. As Angela says, I love history, and I've always been interested in the history of the place where I live. But especially in lockdown, I've been doing lots of walks around the area, as I'm sure you've been doing, and discovering all sorts of nooks and crannies. So I thought I would share with you some of my kind of thoughts and some of my observations about local history. I've chosen 12 places that give a snapshot of the history of Uxbridge. So obviously this talk is not going to be comprehensive. I've left out lots of things. I could easily have given a talk about Uxbridge in 24 places rather than 12 places. And reading through my talk just now, I immediately thought, oh gosh, I should have included the railway station and perhaps Swakeleys and all sorts of other places. So apologies about that. And perhaps in the discussion at the end, you might want to add some of your own favourite places. You're all very welcome. We've got many friends from kind of beyond Uxbridge and beyond the parish. And in a very special way, I'd like to welcome some friends from our local history society, Carol and Tony, and of course, Ken Pierce. I'm really honoured that Ken is with us this evening because, of course, Ken is the Uxbridge historian. And I really recommend his wonderful talks on Uxbridge FM, which you should listen to if you have a chance. So thank you for joining us. And perhaps at the end, we'll say a little bit about the local history society in case you're interested. So let's start, and let's start at the beginning. As you can see, the Stone Age. Now, great Stone Age sites around the world: Stonehenge, France's Lascaux Caves, and of course, Uxbridge, West Drayton, and Useley. For most of us, prehistoric is a rather vague term, isn't it? The word doesn't really make much sense because there is so much history in this period, but the problem is it's not written down. We have to largely rely on archaeology. We can learn a lot about the period, but so many stories and events and personalities are sadly lost to posterity. But actually, our local area is very important when it comes to the Stone Age. In Useley and Stockley Park, numerous flint tools and pottery have been found in the gravel pits that are nearby. In fact, it's one of the most important sites in Europe relating to the Paleolithic period. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Paleolithic period. It's one of these rather nice bits of historical jargon that you see in archaeological publications. But basically, the Stone Age is divided into three main kind of periods. And the earliest one is Paleolithic, the old Stone Age. It's the bit before the Ice Age, basically. Now, when we think of periods, we normally think of fairly short periods like the Tudors and the Stuarts, each of which were just over a century. But the Stone Age as a whole lasted 3 million years. That's quite a long time, 3 million years. So obviously lots of things happened in that period and lots of things that sadly are lost to history. But locally in Stockley Park and Useley, many, many artifacts have been found. In fact, Robert Galloway Rice, who was an antiquarian, he collected over 2,600 artifacts from those gravel pits between 1905 and 1929. And perhaps among the rarest finds that they discovered were evidence of human activity 70,000 years ago and involving the Neanderthals. So there is evidence of Neanderthals in Stockley Park. Uxbridge itself is also quite important for the Stone Age period. And the main site is this one, Three Ways Wharf. Now, if you're not quite sure, that's the Prehistoric office, and it's just opposite the Crown and Treaty. It's by the canal. It's quite close to the Swan and Bottle, and not very far at all from our church. And this has been declared one of the best preserved sites in the country for Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Now, Mesolithic is another bit of archaeological jargon. It's the bit after the Paleolithic, so it's the kind of middle Stone Age. It's as the Ice Age is ending, and it's the bit before the Neolithic Revolution. That's when humans begin to live in towns and villages, and they begin to farm land and domesticate animals. One of the most important kind of revolutions really in history. The Mesolithic is the bit just before this. Humans were still moving from place to place, setting up camp, foraging and hunting for food. Now, in the late 1980s, when they were building this office block at Three Ways Wharf, excavators found a large group of animal bones and lots of flint tools, some dating back to 10,000 to 8,000 BC. It's a time when humans were returning to Britain as the last ice age was ending. Probably during the last ice age, there was no human presence in this country. Conditions were too tough. But now things were stabilizing and humans returned, drawn by the many animals that could be found here. They came to hunt reindeer and deer and wild horses, and of course, the fish in the local river. The landscape was fast changing. Woodland was replacing the Ice Age tundra. And it's quite likely that on this spot, covered now by this office building, on slightly raised land near the River Colne, hunter-gatherers would return from time to time, perhaps from season to season, to hunt and to camp for a few nights. Archaeologists took note of everything they found, even the exact position of every splinter of flint, which was the result of them making long blades and arrowheads. They worked out, rather amazingly, from the evidence they found, that about 20 people were sitting in a semicircle around a fire. Animal bones like reindeer were found, which reveals what they were hunting and eating. And flint scrapers also showed that they were preparing animal skins, probably for clothing and shelter. It's fascinating to think just how they came to Uxbridge. Perhaps they crossed over what is now the North Sea, using that large land bridge, which we now call Doggerland, because Britain was connected to the continent through Doggerland right up until about 6,500 BC. And then they probably followed the Thames, which was really an extension at one point of the Rhine, and then up the Colne to spend a few nights in this spot at Uxbridge. So it really is quite amazing. And now that I've kind of read about this, every time I walk down that way and past Perexor, I think about those hunter-gatherers who were here 12,000 years ago. And yet they were just as human as you and me. They may have had a very different way of communicating and a very different experience of the world, but they would have looked like us, and they would have had the same emotions as us. They would have experienced joy and sorrow, love and pain. I wonder, as those 20 people were sitting around the fire just by the River Colne, I wonder what stories they told each other. And I wonder what sort of understanding they had of the divine, of the creator of this beautiful world. Perhaps they had some sort of ritual that they followed as they sat by that camp. So that's my first place, Three Ways Wharf. Next time you see it, do have a think of those hunter-gatherers. Now, the reason Uxbridge, Useley and West Drayton are so rich in Stone Age artifacts is largely because of their position. They lie in the valley of the River Colne, in the foothills of the Chilterns. The Colne, of course, is an important tributary of the Thames, with rich gravel deposits. And before developments in technology, rivers were absolutely vital. They provided the quickest means of transport, as well, of course, as a supply of fish and good vegetation growing around it. In many ways, you could say the River Colne made Uxbridge, and it even gave it its name. Uxbridge is Anglo-Saxon in origin, and it means the bridge of the Wixen people. We don't know a huge amount about the Wixen people. I think their presence is reflected in several place names in the area, but there were obviously some group, tribe, some group of kinsmen who settled around the crossing of the River Colne here in Uxbridge. Probably more or less the exact area where the hunter-gatherers had camped out all those centuries before. So the true historic heart of Uxbridge is the bit around the bridge, crossing the River Colne, around the Crown and Treaty and the Swan and Bottle. And what we now call the town centre, clustered around St Margaret's Church and the two big shopping centres, that was only developed from the end of the 12th century. In fact, the oldest document in our local archive is the grant of a market to Uxbridge every Thursday in the 1180s. And then the following century, the 13th century, fairs were established in Uxbridge on the Feast of St Margaret, the 20th of July, and also the Feast of St Michael, which always interests me because, of course, our church has the dedication of St Michael, and that goes back really to the very sort of start of the history of Uxbridge as a town. And as you know, we're trying to commission a statue of St Michael for our church, and perhaps we might remember when it finally arrives that there was a fair in Uxbridge on the Feast of the Archangel. Now, in the Middle Ages, fairs were primarily about trading, although of course they were treated as a holiday as well, and they had a strong recreational dimension too. So Uxbridge very quickly grew as a major commercial centre in the district, the market town, the place of these important fairs. And that's something which is never lost. I think today Uxbridge would also still claim to be the major commercial centre where everyone comes and does their shopping. If today the River Colne forms part of the border with Buckinghamshire, it was once the boundary with the Kingdom of Mercia, one of the great Saxon kingdoms. And in the year 893, there was even a battle a few miles away down the River Colne. So we do have a local battlefield. It's the reign of Alfred the Great, and the Saxon English are continually fighting the Vikings, the Danes, who weren't simply raiders, they actually held quite a bit of control across the country. There was a battle at Farnham in Surrey, at which the Vikings were defeated by the son of Alfred the Great, who was called Edward the Elder. And the Vikings retreated across the Thames, probably crossing between Staines and Maidenhead, and then following the River Colne until they found a natural stronghold at an island called Thorney. Now, this is almost certainly the hamlet of Thorney, which is just west of West Drayton, around Richings Park. You've probably driven through it. In former times, the River Colne was much wider and deeper, and quite a significant island was formed there by the intersection of the River Colne, the Colne Brook, and also another nearby stream. And the Vikings found a stronghold on that island, but they were pursued and besieged by Edmund the Elder. He was soon joined by Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, with fresh troops from London. And after several weeks of stalemate, an agreement was reached for the Danes to leave peacefully. Now, this battle has resulted in a series of finds locally by archaeologists. They found a Viking sword and a Saxon dagger, but most surprisingly, and I love this little bit, they found Egyptian treasure. In excavations at Larbourne Farm in the 50s and 60s, unearthed an ancient Egyptian ushpati, similar to the ones in this picture. It's a small statue that was placed in a tomb to act as a sort of servant assisting the deceased in their journey through the afterlife. Now, I guess an explanation for this is that the Vikings got around. They didn't just raid England, they went all over the place, all through the Mediterranean. They got as far as Russia and Baghdad, and indeed they got as far as Egypt. There's evidence that the Vikings got to Alexandria. So perhaps somehow it ended up with a Viking who was in England at the time of this battle in Thorney. It was probably his great bit of treasure, and he buried it in Thorney, probably hoping to recover it at some later date. So this is really the closest thing we have locally to the tomb of Tutankhamun. Now, my third place in Uxbridge is, of course, the medieval church. In most places in England, the oldest surviving building is the church, normally looked after by the Church of England. And despite its suburban nature, the borough of Hillingdon has some very beautiful medieval churches. And one thing I keep meaning to do with Angela is to kind of do a bit of a church crawl and make sure I get inside all our local medieval churches. In 1853, there was even a book written called Church Walks in Middlesex. Church Walks in Middlesex. So, just reminds us that there are some beautiful churches in this area. In Uxbridge, of course, we have St. Margaret's, which you can see on the top right of the screen. But it's not exactly a typical medieval church. It's right in the heart of the town. It's kind of squeezed into various buildings. It has no impressive vicarage or rectory round the corner, and there's no spacious churchyard, as you might expect, crammed full of tombstones in various degrees of decay. A bit later, there was a churchyard built at the bottom of Windsor Street, but in the Middle Ages, all the locals were buried in Hillingdon. And that's the key thing. The reason why St. Margaret's in Uxbridge is squeezed in without this big churchyard is because it only became a parish in its own right in 1827. Up until 1827, St. Margaret's was basically a chapel of ease to St. John's on Hillingdon Hill, which is the church in the big picture. Uxbridge was part of the parish of Hillingdon, and St. John's, and not St. Margaret's, was the ecclesiastical centre. It's worth popping into St. John's when it reopens. It's well worth a visit and has some really interesting medieval brasses. And I went there a few years ago with a friend of mine who sadly is no longer with us, but he was a very keen brass rubber, and he got extremely excited in being given permission to do some brass rubbings in St. John's. Like so many churches, St. John's was built next door to the local manor house, which of course is now Bishop's Hort School. For about 160 years, the manor and the church in Hillingdon belonged to Evesham Abbey, an important Benedictine house in Worcestershire. I don't think there was a monastic community as such in Hillingdon, but the abbey would have had oversight over the manor and the church, and would have also enjoyed a rather healthy income from Hillingdon. After a dispute between the monks and the local bishop, ownership of Hillingdon church and manor passed to the bishops of Worcester, and they occasionally stayed in the manor house next door, which is why it has its rather picturesque name, Bishop's Halt, the place where the bishop halted. St. Margaret's may not have been the parish church in Uxbridge, but it's still a place of great importance. Although heavily restored and remodelled, the basic structure dates back to at least the 14th century, and the south aisle was built by the Guild of St. Margaret and St. Mary. Now, guilds were very prominent in the late medieval church. They were lay organisations that looked after the welfare of its members, both materially and spiritually. It was a kind of combination of a prayer group and a trade union and a private bank. Whenever I go inside St. Margaret's, and I have preached there a number of times, I always look at the medieval beams on the ceiling, and I also look at the 15th century font, and I think of all the generations of Uxbridge folk who encountered God in that place. Now we move on to my fourth location in Uxbridge, another place, another feature that we all know very well. Uxbridge has many waterways. According to Wikipedia, and I'm sure this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, Uxbridge has been called the Venice of West London. It has the Colne, the Pin, the Grand Union Canal, man-made lakes like Little Britain, and of course, the Frays River. This is its proper name, Frays River, not the River Frays. It leaves the Colne near Denham Lock, and it stretches for about 4 miles before rejoining the Colne around West Drayton. Its origins are rather obscure, but it almost certainly bears the name of a chap called Sir John Fray, who was a very prominent 15th century lawyer and member of Parliament, and he had a great interest in rivers. He owned mills in Essex, and he was involved in navigation on the River Lee. He was also linked for a time to Cowley Hall. How much of his river in Uxbridge is natural and how much is man-made is unclear. But it seems that Sir John was probably responsible for forming the river as we know it today, around the year 1450. That's during the time of the Wars of the Roses. He cut a channel from the Colne to a pre-existing stream or tributary so that the power of the water could be harnessed in the mills. Now, this reminds us of a very important aspect of our local history, mills. There were a number of mills in Uxbridge, on the Fraser River and also the River Colne. Uxbridge was known in former times above all for its corn market. Now, the word corn is a word that is used rather vaguely to describe the grain that was most commonly grown locally. So it doesn't necessarily mean maize or corn as we might sometimes think of it. It probably applies in England mostly to wheat. And Uxbridge was a very important corn market in this part of Middlesex. The wheat would have been ground into flour, and in fact Uxbridge supplied much of London's flour in former times. The names of mills are still very much in our midst. We have Fountains Mill near the church, which is now a youth centre. We have Cowley Mill, as in the road, Cowley Mill Road. There's Rabs Mill. There's Old Mill near Little Britain. There's a lane called Old Mill Lane. And the most southerly mill is Drayton Mill, which was later used as a factory and a warehouse by Penguin Books. Incidentally, Uxbridge's last functioning mill was the William King Flour Mill, which stood on the River Colne very near Uxbridge Lock, near what we now call Willowbank. And although it ceased working in 2001, its name lives on in the popular brand of bread, King's Mill. It was the William King Flour Mill, and it gave its name to King's Mill bread. So if you ever see King's Mill bread in the shops, we think of Uxbridge. By the way, I'm not being paid by them any commission to mention their name. Moving on now to my fifth place. It's kind of, I've grouped a few places actually into this one, but I'm thinking of the various Tudor great houses that were in the area. As I said earlier, with Uxbridge, it's all about location, location, location. It was situated within riding distance of London and Windsor and near several waterways. So it's little surprise that the Uxbridge area had many great houses belonging to the nobility and the gentry. The most obvious example, of course, is the large house that once stood near the church in West Drayton, St. Martin's Church. You have to kind of go a little bit behind the high street to find it, but it's really quite surprising because one of the things that remains is this rather magnificent Tudor gatehouse that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. It's really the closest thing we have locally to Hampton Court. And if you go to the graveyard around the church, there's lots of Tudor red brick wall, also dating from the time of this house. This was the home of the Paget family, who were eventually given the title the Earl of Uxbridge. And probably the most famous Earl of Uxbridge was the one who lost his leg at the Battle of Waterloo. Another famous house locally, especially prominent at this time, was Harefield Place, which stood near the medieval church in Harefield, more or less where the Anzac Cemetery is now. Nothing survives of the structure, although it was later rebuilt in a different location just off the drive in Ickenham, and its grounds incorporated what is now the Uxbridge Golf Course. But the original Harefield Place was once the home of the Newdigate family, one of whom, Blessed Sebastian Newdigate, was a Carthusian monk who was martyred for the Catholic faith in 1535. It changed owners several times, and in 1602, Harefield Place was visited by Elizabeth I herself. She stayed for 3 days and she watched a production of Shakespeare's Othello. And we can only speculate, as some have done, whether the bard himself was amongst the company of players on that occasion. But the place I really wanted to focus on is a Tudor house in our area, in our parish, called Southlands Manor. And I must confess, it's the one place I haven't yet visited. I do have the email address of its owner, and I do aim to get in touch with him at some point just to see if we can have a little visit. But This is situated between Uxbridge and Denham. In the reign of Elizabeth, it belonged to the Catholic Peckham family, and it really was at the front line in the changes after the Reformation. After the dissolution of the monasteries, a group of ejected nuns came here. They came from the Bridgetine monastery at Zion, Isleworth, and here in this house they tried to continue for a few years their way of life. Included amongst their number was the abbess of Zion, Agnes Jordan, who seems to have had some local connections. And if you go into the church in Denham, the medieval church, there's a magnificent monumental brass in her memory. The nuns were largely left to their own devices by the authorities. In fact, the abbess left in her will various things to the parishes of Denham, Iver, and even Uxbridge. She left to the church in Uxbridge 2 large altar cloths. The Bridgetine nuns continued in Denham until around 1550, and then they sought refuge in the Low Countries, where they formed a house in a more stable environment. And then in October 1580, Southlands was used for a very important secret meeting of English Jesuit priests, and included among their number was Saint Edmund Campion, who was hanged, drawn and quartered at Tyburn the following year. And this conference was very important in deciding their kind of the Jesuit mission in England, how they were going to evangelize, where they would focus their energies. And amongst other things, as a result of this meeting, several secret printing presses were set up around the country. Now, if we talk of the Catholic martyrs, we should, of course, talk about those who suffered for their Protestant beliefs, because Uxbridge has its Protestant martyrs as well. In August 1555, 3 men were burned at the stake in Uxbridge: John Denley, Robert Smith, and Patrick Packingham, or sometimes called Rockingham. These executions took place at the Lynch, which was a piece of open ground at the bottom of Windsor Street, more or less where the Myjacks roundabout and Crown Court can be found today. None of these men were locals. In fact, John Denley came from Maidstone, and Robert Smith had worked for a time at Eton College, but they were brought to Uxbridge, presumably because it was an important market town and their death could act as a deterrent. Of course, these were very different times from our own, when personal creed was seen as a matter affecting the stability of the state, and heresy was seen as a public crime. Executions were common, and they served not only as popular entertainment, but also as an act of evangelization. The authorities saw it as a way of bringing back straying sheep to the church and setting out authentic teaching. But for the accused, it was also a moment of evangelical witness, and often there were long speeches and which were distributed amongst those who were there. There's a monument to these brave men in the old graveyard at the bottom of Windsor Street, just beside Taipan, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Moving on to the 17th century, we come to the Crown and Treaty. Now, one of the factors that has made Uxbridge Uxbridge are its waterways. I've already alluded to the River Colne and to the Fraser River. But of course, the other key factor in Uxbridge was its position on an important highway, the road from London to Oxford, the Oxford Road. And beyond Oxford, the road went to Gloucester and then to the South Welsh port of Milford Haven. So it was a very important route and communication. Uxbridge was a stop for stagecoaches making their way along, and this road was said to be one of the busiest in the country. So it's little surprise that Uxbridge is a town of inns and public houses. By 1853, there were 54 pubs in central Uxbridge. Sadly, only a few of them surviving today. And the most famous of our pubs is probably the Crown and Treaty, although it didn't start life as a pub. If you're not quite sure where it is, it's opposite our first landmark, the Three Ways Wharf, not far from the Canal and the Swan and Bottle. It's actually all that survives of a large mansion known as The Place, which dates back to the early 16th century. It was built by Thomas Hughes, a lawyer at the court of Henry VIII. It eventually passed to the influential Bennet family, and its great moment of fame came in 1645, when it was used for negotiations between the parliamentarians and the royalists during the British Civil War. Uxbridge was a fairly obvious place to meet. London was a parliamentarian base. Oxford, just up the road, was the royalist capital. That's where the king was based for a time. And Uxbridge was kind of in between. And not only was it in between, but it had good transport links and sufficient accommodation in all those inns and public houses. Neither Charles I or Oliver Cromwell attended these talks in person, but they were represented by the likes of James Stuart, Duke of Richmond, and Algernon Percy, the Earl of Northumberland. The parliamentarians based themselves at the George Inn on the north side of the High Street, and the royalist headquarters was at the Crown Inn on the south side. I'm always rather relieved because my mother's maiden name was Stuart, so I'm rather pleased that the church is on the south side of the High Street, the royalist side. The negotiations took place between the 30th of January and the 22nd of February 1645. They covered all sorts of topics like reform of the church and Ireland and who controls the army, but sadly they failed and no treaty was signed. Nevertheless, the building became known as the Treaty House, and after the canal was built through its grounds, it didn't become such an attractive place to live. A large part of the house was demolished around 1800, and the remaining wing, which we now know, eventually became a pub. Some of the 17th century panelling can be found upstairs, having been returned to its original home in the 50s after being sold to an American enthusiast and spending some time adorning the inside of the Empire State Building. So it's our local link to King Kong. But hopefully before too long, places like the Crown and Treaty will be open again, and I really do encourage you to go and have a look. And they've reopened a few years ago. The theme is very much the English Civil War. All over the interior there are pictures of Charles I and Oliver Cromwell and kind of bits of armour and helmets. So do go and have a look. Now, our 8th place of interest in Uxbridge. So if you're getting bored, we only have a few places left. I'm merging 2 places into this one. I'm going to cheat a little bit then, because in the 18th and early 19th century, Uxbridge was the home of several prominent actors and theatrical managers who had connections with Covent Garden. Cowley Grove on the Cowley Road, which is more or less near the big Lidl that many of you probably use. Cowley Grove was the home of 2 18th century thespians. Firstly, Barton Booth, an actor. It is said that as the ghost in Hamlet, he never had a superior. And then the house passed after him to John Rich, known as the father of English pantomime. He introduced the genre that was popular in Italy, and he was especially notable playing the role of Harlequin. I always joke with Angela, because Angela lives probably on what would have been the grounds of Cowley Grove. And I always say how appropriate it is that Angela lives in the home of the father of English pantomime.
Life is a pantomime sometimes, Father Nicholas, and I'm living it.
But there's a rather charming image of John Rich and his family in the gardens of his villa at Cowley, which you can see on the right-hand side of the PowerPoint. It comes from a painting that was attributed to William Hogarth himself, and it's now kept at the Garrick Club in London. Speaking of the Garrick Club, as you know, in London, there are lots of rather exclusive clubs where we're often dating back to the 18th or 19th centuries. And John Rich, he didn't just introduce pantomime to England, he founded one of these clubs in 1735 with a rather magnificent name of the Sublime Society of Beef Steaks. It met weekly on Saturday. Members wore a blue coat and a buff waistcoat, and its symbol was a gridiron and the words beef and liberty. Apparently at the time, beefsteak was seen not only as a very kind of English thing, but as a symbol of liberty and prosperity, and it was used particularly by the Whigs, who were kind of the liberals as opposed to the Tories. Anyway, the members of this club dined on beef and potatoes, and they drank lots of port, and members included the Prince Regent and Samuel Johnson and William Hogarth. And it still exists. Members are still eating beefsteak to this day, and its premises are near Leicester Square. So perhaps, Angela, we should form the Uxbridge Beefsteak Club. What do you think?
So tomorrow I've got to come to work dressed in blue and buff, have I?
We could give it a go, couldn't we?
Shouting beef and liberty as we walk around the area. I love it.
So Barton Booth is buried at St. Lawrence Cowley, although he was considered important enough to have a monument in Westminster Abbey, which you can see on the left-hand side. John Rich is buried in the graveyard of St. John's, Hillingdon. The other theatrical connection with Uxbridge is in a large brick house that was called Belmont, and gave its name, of course, to Belmont Road. It stood on the edge of Uxbridge Common, and it was the home of Thomas Harris, the proprietor of Covent Garden Theatre. The grounds stretched over 50 acres down to the River Colne and included a mimic hermitage, which is very much the fashion of the time. And I guess that's the hermitage that gave its name to the school, which is nearby now. The house had a well-known collection of portraits of actors of the day, one of which can be found in the National Portrait Gallery. You can see it on your screen. When the house was sold in 1819, the year before Harris's death, the advert in the local newspaper noted that it was fine sporting country. Packs of stag hounds, it said, and the old Berkeley foxhounds and harriers are kept in the neighbourhood, and the River Colne, so celebrated for its trout fishery, runs at the extremity of the grounds. It reminds us that this area was very much hunting country, and the old Berkeley foxhounds, who were based at Aylesbury, they often came in this direction. You can imagine them leaping over the hedges into all the various fields, chasing some unfortunate fox. Uxbridge Common, by the way, was much larger than it is today, and it had stunning views over the area. I guess that's why Belmont was called Belmont, a beautiful hill with a view over the countryside. And interestingly, I don't know if anybody knows more about this, but according to one source I looked at, Uxbridge Common had for many years the only rabbit warren in Middlesex, although the furry creatures were dispersed sometime in the 1800s. As late as 1826, stags were chased over Uxbridge Common. And another colourful sight that you would have seen there in the 19th century were the annual exercises of the Uxbridge Yeomanry. This was a volunteer unit of cavalry that was basically part of the Army Reserve, what we might now call the Territorial Army. Another notable resident lived just over Uxbridge Common in a house called the Chestnuts, which is on Honeycroft Hill at the side of what is now St Andrew's Park. It was the home of perhaps one of our most famous residents, William Wilberforce, who of course was one of the great figures in the abolition of slavery. And he lived in this house between 1824 and 1826. In fact, the day he retired from Parliament, he recorded in his diary that he stayed quietly at Uxbridge, spending the time very pleasantly. He kept a low profile, but he received all sorts of visitors whilst he was living in Uxbridge, including the author Thomas Babington Macaulay, and even Sir Stamford Raffles, the founder of Singapore. Then in 1826, Wilberforce moved to a house in Mill Hill, and he died in 1833. Talking of slavery, there's a very interesting connection in the graveyard at Hillingdon, St John's, Hillingdon. If you look very carefully in the graveyard, you might find this tomb, which says, "Here lieth Toby Pleasant, an African born into slavery. He was early in life rescued from West Indian slavery by a gentleman of this parish, which he ever gratefully remembered, and who he continued to serve as a free man, honestly and faithfully, to the end of his life." And he died in 1784, aged 45. the gentleman of the parish was John Lane, who was lived in one of the local houses, and he was obviously very wealthy because included amongst his possessions was one of the most famous paintings painted by William Hogarth, Marriage a la Mode, and that was in Hillingdon for a time. Tobias protected his master famously when he was attacked by a highwayman at Shepherd's Bush in 1780. The former slave gave evidence at the trial, and he regretted giving evidence that would send the prisoner to the gallows, and he said, "I am very sorry to say it, because life is sweet. I wish I could save him, but I must speak the truth." So a grave to a very remarkable man, and if only the gravestone could speak, because I'm sure it would be wonderful to hear all the details of his story. We're now moving on to our 10th location, the Canal. Now, I'm sure we all love a walk along the canal, the Grand Union Canal, or as it was originally called, the Grand Junction Canal. The idea was, of course, to link the River Thames and London to the canal system of the Midlands and beyond. It really was a kind of motorway of the late 18th century. The canal reached Uxbridge in November 1794. Initially, boats would have travelled to and from London after joining the Thames at Brentford, but in 1801, a new canal linked up to Paddington, branching off at Hayes, which was a much more direct route. By 1805, the canal stretched all the way to Brownston in Northamptonshire, and if you walk along the canal, occasionally you'll see these mile markers saying, for example, that Braunston is 81 miles away. This one can be found just near Uxbridge Lock. Canals were especially useful in transporting bulky goods. In Uxbridge's case, flour and other local products, and also coal would have come into Uxbridge, which of course was very necessary. In those early years, probably around 20,000 tons of goods were transported from Uxbridge every year by the canals. Wharfs and industrial buildings appeared alongside, but of course the canals faced fierce new competition when the railways arrived. And of course now canals are largely a leisure resource, a nice place to walk along or perhaps have a holiday on a barge. As early as 1801, passenger boats ran to Paddington from Cowley, from the dock just opposite what is now the Water's Edge restaurant. The boat was pulled by 4 horses, it cost 2 shillings, and it took about 3 hours to go from Cowley to Paddington. A bit slower than by road, but certainly cheaper and smoother, and it had the luxury of onboard refreshments, tea and coffee, and the crew wore blue uniforms with yellow capes and yellow buttons. There were several attempts at keeping this packet boat going, but it ultimately couldn't compete with the other means of transport. But at least it gave its name to a pub, which sadly closed down recently, the Paddington Packet Boat. Moving on to our 11th place, how could we give a talk about the history of Uxbridge without briefly mentioning RAF Uxbridge on what is now St Andrew's Park? This stood on the estate that once belonged to Hillingdon House, which can still be seen and I believe has recently been refurbished. The previous owners of Hillingdon House included the Duke of Schomberg, who was a friend of William of Orange, who played a crucial role in the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. I'm sure any Irish viewers would have their own opinion about this gentleman. Also living in Hillingdon House was at one point was the Marchioness of Rockingham, who was the widow of an 18th century prime minister, which gave its name to Rockingham Road, and more recently the Cox family, who were important bankers and had a close connection to the British Army. But just before the First World War, the Cox family decided to sell their estate, and after a brief time as a convalescent home for wounded Canadian soldiers, the new Royal Flying Corps moved into Uxbridge in the winter of 1917-18, and it came with its armament and gunnery school previously set up at Perryvale. And in fact, if you walk round what is now Dowding Park, you can see the area where they practiced some of their shooting. The base grew It came to include the RAF School of Music, and I'm sure many of you will remember hearing the distant sound of the band practicing as you walk around the area. But of course, it's best known for its secret bunker, built to house the number 11 Fighter Group Operations Room, a bunker that was opened just a few days before the outbreak of the Second World War. I won't say too much about it because I'm sure many of you have been to the museum and have been down to the bunker, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with this part of our history. But it basically controlled 7 sector airfields in the southeast of England and their fighter squadrons, including quite a few Polish pilots. And it was used, of course, to coordinate the Battle of Britain. On one of his visits here, on the 16th of August 1940, Winston Churchill said the famous words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Words first spoken at Uxbridge and then repeated 4 days later in his famous speech to Parliament. The bunker was also used in coordinating aerial support in the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940 and also in the D-Day landings. So although the RAF left Uxbridge just over 10 years ago, we can indeed be very proud of this part of our history. And if you haven't been to the Battle of Britain bunker, then please do so once restrictions are lifted. Now, we're already at our final location, and I thought I would mention my house. Catholic presbyteries are normally purpose-built for the church, and they have few former residents beyond parish priests and their co-workers and the odd housekeeper. But our presbytery is an exception to this. It was built in 1903, not as a presbytery, but as an Edwardian family home. In those days, it wasn't 1 Osborne Road, it was 37 Lawn Road. And it only became the priest's residence after being sold in 1915. And according to the advert in the local paper, when it was being sold, the property had a spacious garden, outbuildings, and even a stable, which is, I guess, where the church and the hall now stand. You see, I gave up my garden so that we could have a church. Prior to that, it was the home of the Osborne family, who gave their name to Osborne Road. And they weren't Catholics, they were staunch Congregationalists. The man of the house was this gentleman, Jabez Osborne. He had a successful painting, decorating, plumbing, and signwriting business, originally based at Montague Road, but moving to buildings next to what is now the presbytery. So where the church hall is now, there were sort of outbuildings where his workshops were. According to Jabez's obituary in 1936, he was one of Uxbridge's best known townsmen, a familiar figure not only as a businessman, but also as a member of the Urban Council and the Board of Guardians, which administered local poor relief. He is described as being cheery and optimistic, and he followed the old Essex custom, because he came from Essex originally, of calling everybody neighbour. Hello, neighbour. Good morning, neighbour. He was a keen sportsman, an excellent shot, and one of the early devotees of Diabolo, which is a kind of juggling game. And although not being a Catholic, he had a friendship with the Catholic priest, Father John Brady, and often played him at billiards in the Young Men's Literary Society. Of his children, who would have lived in the presbytery for a time, Jabez Jr. was for many years the bandmaster of the Uxbridge and Hillingdon band, who I guess would have played in Fastenage Park, where there's that rather nice bandstand. And Herbert, another son, became a missionary, working in what is now Mozambique. And during the First World War, Herbert joined the Nyasaland Field Force. Now, Nyasaland is modern-day Malawi. So many exotic tales would have been told between these presbytery walls. Now, why do I mention my house? It's not particularly interesting, really, but it reminds us that every place, every house has a story. Perhaps some of us live in an old house where the past is very tangible. But even in a new build or a block of flats, it's always interesting to find out who used to own the land, whether there's any interesting local connection, whether there's a story behind the road name or even the house name. Scratch under the tarmac and the concrete, there's always a hidden history. You and I are links in a long chain stretching back to those men and women and children who hunted reindeer and told stories round a fire by the River Colne 12,000 years ago. It's our history and we're part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father Nicholas. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. Now I'm going to put everybody back onto gallery view so I can see everybody in case there's people that would like to ask some questions. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, so much in there. I think we're all going to have to rewatch it again tomorrow, actually. I think we've whizzed through huge amounts. Before we start to lose people, a couple of things I would just like to say. Tomorrow night, we've got a generation game on Zoom. Do join us if you've never done it before. Pencil and paper's all you need in the Zoom link, and it will be an absolute giggle. And let me just turn that off. Perfect. And then the next talk is going to be on the Feast of St. Joseph, which is the 19th of March. And it'll be at 7:30, and it'll be all about St. Joseph. Is that right, Father Nicholas?
Yeah, because it's the year of St. Joseph. So I'm going to look, haven't written the talk yet, but I'm just going to look at the figure of Joseph in the Bible and in our tradition. So something a bit different from tonight.
Perfect. So has anyone got questions? Now I could